be damaging our health. Not if you believe the companies behind them. But last summer, Arpad Pushti, a respected scientist with more than 30 years' experience, went public on research showing that genetically tinkered with potato damaged the health of rats and therefore posed a potential risk to humans. Within hours, his findings were being rubbished, the attack being led by his employers at the Rowett Research Institute, who said that Dr. Pushti had got himself into a muddle. Now, as our science correspondent Susan Watts reports, there are claims that it was his bosses who might have been muddled.
Initially tested on humans.
This man is not allowed to talk about whether genetically engineered foods are dangerous to our health. He was an internationally renowned scientist, but when he went public with his findings, he was silenced. Is that because he's a poor scientist, or because his results were too inconvenient for the GM food lobby?
Dr. Pushti was publicly humiliated as a result of an interview that he gave. And a group of scientists, some 20 of us in all, from different countries, specializing in toxicology, in genetic engineering and in medicine, have reviewed his data and that of the audit report of the Rowett Institute. And we find that his data is sound. We think that it would pass peer review and be published. And we are at a loss to really explain why the Rowett Institute came to the conclusion that it did in the audit report, which was basically that there was nothing to report.
When Arpad Pushti first revealed his research to me on Newsnight a year ago, there were only a handful of products on our supermarket shelves containing genetically modified ingredients. Now there are hundreds. And today, Europe voted on whether to allow genetically modified foods to be fed to animals. Britain voted against. The issue is finally ringing everybody's alarm bells. And the reason, BSE taught us that tampering with animal feed can have a devastating impact on human health. The government is worried now that this could be their BSE. In Europe today there were two votes. The second banned any GM crop that uses genes that might transfer antibiotic resistance to bacteria in animals or people, and so make diseases more difficult to treat. The use of these genes is potentially one of the most worrying aspects of these new crops. This former Porton Down scientist has sat on almost every government advisory committee on these new technologies. He says it's time these marker genes were dropped altogether.
I think the main concern is where you take a marker of this type and it's linked into a plant chromosome. It's then eaten raw by an animal, and we don't know how long the DNA will survive. We suspect it will survive. We don't know if that DNA will get across into the intestinal bacteria of the animal itself. And if it gets there, then it can be transmitted to humans, and at that point, we're compromising current antibiotics and their use.
And on top of the superbug problem, Arpad Pushti's research on rats raised other concerns, that genetically modified foods might have subtle, long-term effects on our health.
Dr. Pushti found that rats that were given these genetically modified potatoes for about 10 days showed unexpected findings, including organ weight loss and changes to the immune system. Now, we don't know the full significance of that yet, but it does raise questions about chronic low-dose toxicity of changes to food. And the thing is that the companies that are actually trying to push this technology have plans to actually change many of the basic staple foods of our diet, and that has long-term implications.
It was on Newsnight just over a year ago that the work of Dr. Pushti on rats was first brought to public attention. By August, he had the results from his research and showed on World in Action how the rats had been damaged when fed genetically altered potatoes. But his findings were rubbished, and he lost his job at the government-funded Rowett Research Institute in Aberdeen. Now, though, it seems he was right all along. So why was the Rowett Institute's director, Philip James, so quick to dismiss Dr. Pushti's work on GM crops? James wrote the government's blueprint on its much-vaunted Food Standards Agency and has long been tipped to head it. The powerful producers of these new foods wouldn't have welcomed news that his institute was raising questions over safety. So were the motives more political than scientific? Yesterday in Parliament, Liberal Democrat Paul Tyler asked Jack Cunningham to look again at Pushti's work at the Rowett Institute.
Which has been looking again at some of the results of the research undertaken last year into the impact of genetically modified food on the immune systems of rats and by definition therefore on humans.
Madam Speaker, I can assure the honourable gentleman and the House that the government does understand and act upon genuine concerns from the public and from members of the House, and I assure him...
Jack Cunningham claimed there was no need for a moratorium on growing GM foods and cited the cautious countryside group English Nature in support. But today, they made clear that they cannot reassure the public that these crops are safe. The Tories are making the most of this.
Dr. Cunningham was simply misleading the public, hadn't done his homework. The letter from the chairman of English Nature, appointed by this government, a Labour supporter, and English Nature, by law, advises the government on these matters. Her letter is absolutely clear. She says there should be a 3-year delay before the commercial growth of these crops is approved. She says that the government is not making decisions on the basis of good environmental science, and that at the moment the technology is not environmentally safe.
The government says it's holding the GM multinationals in check through an effective moratorium on their work. But one of the government's advisors says the deal isn't worth the paper it's written on.
I think the so-called moratorium is a bit of a sham. It's not a moratorium that the government have called. It's simply the government doing a deal with some of the companies to agree that they're not ready to commercialise some of these crops for 1 or 3 years, depending on the crop. And in that time, there'll be some space for some extra testing. I think the problem with that is the extra testing isn't going to answer a lot of the questions, and the government's got to have the guts in the end to say, well, we are calling a pause, we are calling a moratorium if the results of the environmental testing is not adequate.
And tonight, Newsnight learned that supermarket chains where GM foods are already on sale are tired of being caught in the middle. They fear baffled consumers are about to vote against these foods in their shops and want ministers to give clear advice on whether these new foods are safe.
Well, as Susan Watts mentioned, the Cabinet Office Minister Jack Cunningham heads the Cabinet Committee charged